All things exist in the human imagination. And everything you see as an objective reality was produced by imagining. Think of one thing, just think of one thing that would simply deny it. You can't think of one thing. So you go to the moon. You first had to imagine it. Had to imagine everything concerning the machine that took you to the moon. Everything in the world first has to be imagined and then executed. The intelligence to do it will come, but you take the blueprint first and conceive it and dwell in it as though it were true. And no power on earth can stop it from becoming so. But tonight, if you're here for the first time and you want something practical, you apply what I've told you. First, have an objective. You must have an objective. You can't say, well, I don't know what I want. Well, all right. Come back the next time. Ask yourself, what would I like of life? Don't be ashamed to name it, what would I like of life? Well then, try to get some objective. Now, prayer, as far as I'm concerned, is nothing more than the subjective appropriation of the objective hope. That is the way to success. I appropriate it subjectively. How do I appropriate a state subjectively? Well, suppose now, this very moment, I wanted a ball, an ordinary baseball. But there isn't a baseball in the room, all right? But I want one. I would actually assume that I am holding a baseball in my hand until I can feel it. You think you can't feel it? Well, now try it. Try to feel what it would be like if you held a baseball. Now, to prove that you have held it, see what it feels like, the difference now, a tennis ball. See any difference? All right, a golf ball. See any difference? A piece of silk. You feel any difference? If you can distinguish between these many objects, though they are subjective, then they must exist somewhere. If you can actually separate them in your mind's eye and distinguish between these objects, I can begin to feel, begin to sense, begin to smell a rose. Well, a rose doesn't smell or doesn't actually have the odor of another flower. I can detect the rose. Now a lily, an Easter lily. I can detect that. Well, what does it do? Well, I'm going to get them. Someone will think of Neville and send him a flower. And it's going to be the flower that I'm going to actually feel and touch and smell. It works that way. Money has an odor. It's unlike any odor in the world. It's more fragrant to the miser than the most marvelous perfume in the world. He can tell it. You put a money bag to his face, and it's like putting roses to mine. He loves it. He can smell money. Can feel it. Money has a distinct feel about it. Put a $20 bill in your hand and ask you to feel it, and then put another piece of paper in your hand, and you can tell the difference. There's a difference. It is an odor to it. All this is part of the inner man, that all things are possible to him. Try it. Before you condemn it, try it. And if you have the evidence to support my claim, well, then it doesn't matter what the world will tell you. If he laughs at you, so what? So they laughed at everyone who had an idea that seemed a little bit off-center. Always laughed at him. They laughed at the idea of going to the moon. Well, now it's an accomplished fact. There are still those who won't believe it happened, you know, because they don't want to believe that it ever happened. There are those who said you couldn't go down and actually live underwater. Now we have a submarine. There are still those who won't believe it. You can present them with all the facts in the world, and they won't believe it. So I tell you, you try it first. And if it proves itself in performance, it doesn't really matter what the whole vast world thinks. So tonight, take a goal. Make it a lovely goal, either for yourself or for another. Anytime that you exercise your imagination lovingly on behalf of another, you're mediating God to that other. So, bring a friend before your mind's eye. Represent him to yourself as the man or the woman that you would like them to be. And don't tell them, ask for no praise, just assume that they're talking to you and telling you the most marvelous news about themselves. And you congratulate them on that good news. And go your own way. Believe in the reality of that imaginal act. It may happen tomorrow. It may happen the day after, or a week later, or a month later. It has its own appointed hour, and it is ripening, and it's going to flower. So don't be concerned. Leave it alone, and it will come to pass. So this is what I mean by feeling is the secret. I catch the mood, the feeling that would be mine if I were what I want to be. I don't have to touch something. I can if I want to. But it's the mood I'm speaking of. What would the feeling be like if she were well? If she were this? And then you catch it, just as though it is true. You always go to the end, and the end is where you begin. You're always imagining ahead of our evidence. So go to the end and feel the end, and then dwell in that end, even though reason denies it and your senses deny it. You turn your back upon the doubters. That is your senses and what reason dictates. That's the hell or the devil or Satan in the world. That's the doubter. So you turn your back upon it. And then you walk as though things were as you want them to be. And living in that assumption, it slowly hardens into fact. Even though at the moment of the assumption it was denied by reason, an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. So you learn to assume and learn to persist in the assumption, and it will come to pass. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they also might be sanctified through the truth. The ideal we serve and strive to attain could never be evolved from us, were it not potentially involved in our nature. It is now my purpose to retell and to emphasize an experience of mine, printed by me 2 years ago. I believe these quotations from the search will help us to understand the operation of the law of consciousness and show us that we have no one to change but self. Once in idle intervals at sea I meditated on the perfect state and wondered what I would be were I of too pure eyes to behold inequity, if to me all things were pure, and were I without condemnation. As I became lost in this fiery brooding, I found myself lifted above the dark environment of the senses. So intense was feeling, I felt myself a being of fire dwelling in a body of air, voices as from a heavenly chorus, with the exaltation of those who had been conquerors in a conflict with death, were singing, He is risen, He is risen. And intuitively, I knew they meant me. Then I seemed to be walking in the night. I soon came upon a scene that might have been the ancient pool of Bethesda, for in this place lay a great multitude of impotent folk, blind, halt-withered, waiting not for the moving of the water as of tradition, but waiting for me. As I came near, without thought or effort on my part, they were, one after the other, molded as by the magician of the beautiful, eyes, hands, feet, all missing members, were drawn from some invisible reservoir and molded in harmony with that perfection which I felt springing within me. When all were made perfect, the chorus exulted, It is finished. Then the scene dissolved and I awoke. I know the vision was the result of my intense meditation upon the idea of perfection. For my meditations invariably bring about union with the state contemplated. I had been so completely absorbed within the idea that for a while I had become what I contemplated. And the high purpose with which I had for that moment identified myself drew the companionship of high things and fashioned the vision in harmony with my inner nature. The ideal with which we are united works by association of ideals to awaken 1,000 moves to create a drama in keeping with the central idea. My mystical experiences have convinced me that there is no way to bring about the outer perfection we seek other than by the transformation of ourselves. In the divine economy, nothing is lost. We cannot lose anything save by descent from the sphere where the thing has its natural life. There is no transforming power in death, and whether we are here or there, we fashion the world that surrounds us by the intensity of our imagination and feeling. And we illuminate or darken our lives by the concepts we hold of ourselves. Nothing is more important to us than our conception of ourselves. And especially is this true of our concept of the dimensionally great one within us. Those who help or hinder us, whether they know it or not, are the servants of that law which shapes outward circumstances in harmony with our inner nature. It is our conception of ourselves which frees or constrains us, though it may use material agencies to achieve its purpose. Because life molds the outer world to reflect the inner arrangement of our minds, there is no way of bringing about the outer perfection we seek other than by the transformation of ourselves. No help cometh from without. The hills to which we lift our eyes are those of inner reign. It is thus to our own consciousness that we must turn as to the only reality, the only foundation on which all phenomena can be explained. We can rely absolutely on the justice of this law to give us only that which is of the nature of ourselves. To attempt to change the world before we change our concept of ourselves is to struggle against the nature of things. There can be no outer change until there is first an inner change, as within, so without. I am not advocating philosophical indifference when I suggest that we should imagine ourselves as already that which we want to be, living in a mental atmosphere of greatness rather than using physical means and arguments to bring about the desired change. Everything we do, unaccompanied by a change of consciousness, is but futile readjustment of surfaces. However we toil or struggle, we can receive no more than our assumptions affirm. To protest against anything which happens to us is to protest against the law of our being and our rulership over our own destiny. The circumstances of my life are too closely related to my conception of myself not to have been formed by my own spirit from some dimensionally larger storehouse of my being. If there is pain to me in these happenings, I should look within myself for the cause, for I am moved here and there and made to live in a world in harmony with my concept of myself. Intense meditation brings about a union with the state contemplated, and during this union you see vision of experiences and behave in keeping with our change of consciousness. This shows us that a transformation of consciousness will result in a change of environment and behavior. All wars prove that violent emotions are extremely potent in precipitating mental rearrangements. Every great conflict has been followed by an era of materialism and greed, in which the ideals for which the conflict ostensibly were waged are submerged. This is inevitable because war evokes hate, which impels a descent in consciousness from the plane of the ideal to the level where the conflict is waged. If we could become as emotionally aroused over our ideals as we become over our dislike we would ascend to the plane of our ideal as easily as we now descend to the level of our hate. Love and hate have a magical transforming power, and we grow through their exercise into the likeness of what we contemplate. By intensity of hatred, we create in ourselves the character we imagine in our enemy. Qualities die for want of attention. So the unlovely states might best be rubbed out by imaging beauty for ashes and joy for mourning, rather than by direct attacks on the state from which we would be free. Whatsoever things are lovely and of good report, think on these things, for we become that with which we are en rapport. There is nothing to change but our concept of self. As soon as we succeed in transforming self, our world will dissolve and reshape itself in harmony with that which our change affirms.
You know, there's a wide difference between thinking of what you want in this world and thinking from what you want. Let me tell you, when I first heard of the strange and wonderful power of the imagination, it was in 1933 in New York City. An old friend of mine taught it to me. He turned to the 14th of John, and this is what he read. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. He explained to me that this central character of the Gospels was human imagination. That mansion was not a place in some heavenly house, but simply my desire. If I would make a living representation of the state desired, and then enter that state and abide in that state, I would realize it. At the time, I wanted to make a trip to the island of Barbados in the West Indies, but I had no money. He explained to me that if I would that night, as I slept in New York City, assume that I was sleeping in my earthly father's house in Barbados, and go sound asleep in that state, that I would realize my trip. Well, I took him at his word and tried it. For 1 month, night after night, as I fell asleep, I assumed I was sleeping in my father's home in Barbados. At the end of my month, an invitation from my family came, inviting me to spend the winter in Barbados. I sailed for Barbados the early part of December of that year. From then on, I knew I had found this Savior in myself. The old man told me that it would never fail. Even after it happened, I could hardly believe that it would not have happened anyway. That's how strange this whole thing is. On reflection, it happens so naturally. You begin to feel or to tell yourself, well, it would have happened anyway. And you quickly recover from this wonderful experience of yours. It never failed me if I would give the mood, the imagined mood, sensory vividness. I could tell you unnumbered case histories to show you how it works. But in essence, it's simple. You simply know what you want. When you know what you want, you're thinking of it. That is not enough. You must now begin to think from it. Well, how could I think from it? I am sitting here, and I desire to be elsewhere. How could I, while sitting here physically, put myself in imagination at a point in space removed from this room and make that real to me? Quite easily. My imagination puts me in touch inwardly with that state. I imagine that I am actually where I desire to be. Now, can I tell that I am there? There is only one way to prove that I am there. For what a man sees when he describes his world is as he describes it relative to himself. So what the world looks like depends entirely upon where I stand when I make my observation. So if, as I describe my world, it is related to that point in space I imagine that I am occupying, then I must be there. I am not there physically, no, but I am there in my imagination, and my imagination is my real self. And where I go in imagination and make it real, there I shall go in the flesh also. When in that state I fall asleep, it is done. I have never seen it fail. So this is the simple technique on how to use your imagination to realize your every objective.
Here in New York City many years ago, this lady, a lady of considerable means, she left her home in New York City and went off to Paris with her 2 children, leaving her home and her maid. Before she returned, the maid took all of her furniture and took it away. When she returned, the apartment was there. Rent was paid every month. But there was no furniture, not a thing in it. She employed a private agency, told the police department, told all the authorities in New York City, and plus her private agency. At the end of a few months, they did not turn up one thing concerning that stolen property. She came to see me. I said, all right, you're seated there and I'm seated here in my apartment, aren't we? Now, you are not seated in my apartment. You are seated right now. Close your eyes. You're seated in your own apartment. And you had a grand piano? She said, no, I had a piano, but it wasn't a concert grand. It was grand, but not a concert grand. And on it I had my pictures of my 2 children. And I had pictures of the wall. She told me what they were. And the furniture, I said, all right, refurnish that place as you left it. You have a memory. She did. Now, when I stopped talking, it's because you have refurnished that place to me. Now you're going to go in and you aren't going to see your apartment from my apartment. You're in your apartment. And you can feel your chair and get off your chair and feel the piano and see the children, the pictures of the children, and that's what you're going to do. She agreed she would do it. And then we simply broke the spell. What did it take? 2 minutes? 3 minutes? That week, she went to her bank on Madison Avenue. As she was coming out of the bank, she had a past history of a little mental state where she was put away for a while because she needed psychiatric treatment. And the bars on this window reminded her of her past history and therefore addled her for a while. So she came onto Madison Avenue and turned south instead of turning north, where she should have. When she discovered her mistake, she was at the end of the block. When she got there and discovered her mistake, she looked down, and 2 very familiar ankles were standing right before her. She came up to the face, that's her maid. And the maid spotted it and started to scream. She went over to the maid and grabbed her before the light changed and hailed the oncoming taxi and said, you're taking me right now. And the maid, who could have killed her, she was so big and strong, was so reduced to impotency because of the discovery. And the maid took her to the place where she had stored that furniture. She said, I'm not bringing action against you. I want my furniture. And she got it back into her own apartment within the week. A seeming mistake was the way the Father laid her. All I ask is to go to the end. If I go to the end and give thanks to the end and for the end, it's done. Now let the one in the depths of my own being devise the best means to take me to that end. The end is where I start. The end is my beginning. And that is a story that I know from personal experience. So do not attempt to devise the means and tell the one that you ask to pray for you how it should be done. He will lose all interest and turn his back and say, go elsewhere. You don't go into a doctor's office and tell him what he should do. If you go to him because you trust him, Well, then, you either got to trust him and continue, or you're going to leave him. Well, if you go to someone that you really believe who knows how to pray, don't tell him how to do it and what means should be employed in order to do it. He is going to go to the end if he knows how to pray. The end is where we begin. In my end is my beginning. And we're always ahead of our evidence. So I go to the end. I see the whole thing done, and then drop it. Then let it happen in my world.
Now, as you're seated here, that's all about you. Your own wonderful human imagination is the God of the universe. That is the one spoken of as the Lord Jesus. That's the one. Is it really true? Well, you're called upon to test it. Test it and see if it's true. Now, I have a letter on me tonight. I really should read it, but I'm not going to. I should read it just as he wrote it, but I'll tell you the contents of the letter. This gentleman hasn't been here in years. The last time I saw him was at the Ebell. Well, you know who have been coming since the Ebell, how long that has been. He said, I must tell you this story. It may not make sense, but I must tell it. For it's the first time that I have ever used my training according to the things that I have heard you say. I am a psychologist, and I wasted years trying to talk people out of their mental problems when I could easily have imagined them whole and happy. Now, here is the story. He said, a friend of mine, this lady, claimed that she was in many ways abnormal. She and her husband adopted a little baby girl, and something very strange went wrong with the child. The child was 4 years old and still could not speak, and the few words it muttered, it garbled so that it is simply not intelligible. But in the 4 years talking to her, there was progress. Then one day she said to me, I do not feel any longer that I am abnormal. So now I say to myself, I am not abnormal. He tried to explain to her that that's not quite the approach. And then he broke the thought and he told me this story. He said, for instance, in my own case, I find a home that I want. I begin to imagine that I'm living in that home, and then doubt sets in, with the result that that doubt materializes into a person. And that person has more money than I have, and he buys the home, leaving me out in the cold. I know from that experience that every person in my world only reflects a mood in me. Everyone that I meet, whether I know them or a stranger who buys the home that I wanted. When the doubt set in, the doubt materialized into a person. I didn't know him, but he only reflects that mood of doubt in me. So he has more money and he buys the home, and I am out in the cold. So I reconstructed a sentence for this lady. And I said, no longer must you say, I am not abnormal. You must now begin to say, I am perfectly normal. She said, I do not feel that. He said, I do not care whether you feel it or not. You must begin to persuade yourself that you are perfectly normal. by repeating within yourself, I am perfectly normal. The day she began it, the child went into a coma. So profound was the sleep that it was difficult to rouse her. She could not be awakened. She asked me to examine the child. I said, no, take her to a medical clinic and have them examine the child. But as she began, from his suggestion, to assume I am perfectly normal, within 24 hours the child awoke. They made the test in the medical center and found her alert and bright. She was only the outpictured statement of that mother who adopted her. The mother began to feel, I am abnormal. So she adopts a little child, a little girl. And the girl for 4 years couldn't talk. And when she began, it was so garbled, it made no sense. She only bore witness to that strange, peculiar claim of the mother who adopted her. And when she changed the pattern of speech within her and said, I am perfectly normal, the child, by the medical clinic, found her not only alert, but perfectly healthy and returning to a normal state in this world. The whole vast world is yourself pushed out. All that you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your own wonderful human imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow.
If I now tell what I experienced that night, I do so not to impose my ideas on others, but that I may give hope to those who, like Nicodemus, wonder how can a man be born when he is old? How can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? How can this be? Well, this is how it happened to me. A heavenly dream in which the arts flourished was suddenly interrupted by the most intense vibration centered at the base of my skull. Then a drama as real as those I experience when I am fully awake began to unfold. I felt myself within my skull, trying to force my way out through its base. Something gave way, and I felt myself move, head downward, through the base of my skull. I squeezed myself out, inch by inch. When I was almost out, I held what I took to be the foot of the bed and pulled the remaining portion of me out of my skull. There on the floor, I laid for a few seconds. Then I rose and looked at my body on the bed. It was lying on its back and tossing from side to side like one in recovery from a great ordeal. As I contemplated it, hoping that it would not fall off the bed, I became aware that the vibration which started the whole drama was not only in my head, but now was also coming from the corner of the room. As I looked over to the corner and wondered if that vibration could be caused by a very high wind, a wind strong enough to vibrate the window, I could not believe that the vibration which I still felt within my head was related to that which seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. Looking back to the bed, I discovered that my body was gone, but in its place sat my 3 oldest brothers. My oldest brother sat where the head was. My second and third brothers sat where the feet were. None seemed to be aware of me, although I was aware of them and could discern their thoughts. I suddenly became aware of the reality of my own invisibility. I noticed that they too were disturbed by the vibration coming from the corner of the room. My third brother was the most disturbed and went over to investigate the cause of the disturbance. His attention was attracted by something on the floor, and looking down, he announced, "It is Neville's baby." My other 2 brothers, in most incredulous voices, asked, "How can Neville have a baby?" My brother lifted the infant wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid him on the bed. I then, with my invisible hands, lifted the babe and asked him, "How is my sweetheart?" He looked into my eyes and smiled, and I awoke in this world to ponder this greatest of my many mystical experiences. One other vision I will tell, because it bears out the truth of my assertion that the Bible is mystical fact, that everything written about the promised child is in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms, and it must be mystically experienced in the imagination of the individual. The child's birth is a sign and a portent, signaling the resurrection of the patriarchs in the imagination of him in whom the child is born. 6 months after the birth of the child, a vibration similar to the one which preceded his birth started in my head. This time, its intensity was centered at the top of my head. Then came a sudden explosion, and I found myself in a modestly furnished room. There, leaning against the side of an open door, was my son David of biblical fame. He was a lad about 12 years old. What struck me forcibly about him was the unusual beauty of his face and figure. He was, as he is described in the first book of Samuel, ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and very handsome. Not for one moment did I feel myself to be anyone other than Neville. Yet I knew that this lad David was my son, and he knew that I was his father. As I sat there contemplating the beauty of my son, the vision faded, and I awoke. What conclusion can be reached from these mystical experiences? The chamber of man's imagery. In man's imagination are engraven every patriarch and character in the Old Testament, and that after the birth of the child, out of the skull of man, signifying that man's rebirth from above, there will begin the resurrection of the patriarchs. Each, in his turn, will be revealed as the son of the man who resurrects him. When all are resurrected from the dead, that man in whom they are resurrected will know himself to be of the Elohim, the God who became man, that man may become God.
She felt did so much for, that she wants to show her appreciation. She did it then. She was playing the part of Thaddeus. That is Thaddeus, one of the most neglected characters in Scripture, for it means praise. It means thanksgiving. And so few people will stop to say thanks. Were there not 10 of you, and only one returned to say thank you? There were 10 who were instantly cured, and only one came back to say thank you. That's Thaddeus. And so if you actually express joy, express thanksgiving for the slightest little thing done you are actually exercising that talent that is known in Scripture as Thaddeus. It's personified as a disciple. He's the 10th one. And so neglected because so few people are grateful. First of all, they reflect upon what happened. And then they give all praise to the means employed rather than the actual cause of the phenomenon. But here tonight, we are simply presenting Andrew. So I brought you tonight to meet Jesus. And I do not point to any being outside of you. Do not look for him in any face. Do not look for him in any place in the world. I point within you to the Lord Jesus Christ. And he is your own wonderful human imagination. Man is God and exists in us and we in him. The eternal body of man is the imagination, and that is God himself. Now, before we go into the silence, let me once more try to explain this simple technique. You will have to practice it and use your own rhythm. You don't have to be in church to do it. You can be sitting here tonight. You can be at home listening to nice music. You can be simply relaxing with a drink. It doesn't matter what you're doing and where you are, but want to do it. Get into a lovely, quiet, relaxed frame. No so-called holy attitude. Forget that. You're holy when you're in love. God is love. So you would love it for someone else. That is all that you need. That mood. Wouldn't it be wonderful if she actually had it? If he had it? If they had it? Also, you know exactly what you want now. And then you imagine you are seeing them. You can see them in your mind's eye and see them vividly. And then breathe yourself into a rhythm. They're telling you that they have it. And you're getting yourself worked up emotionally because they're telling you that they have exactly what you know they would want in this world. And then you reach a certain point and you explode. Something actually goes out of you. It's power. And you'll read the words, "Who touched me? For I perceive virtue has gone out of me." At that moment, she was healed. Who touched me? And they say what? With the crowd? How could you tell who touched you with this enormous crowd? You know. You did it yourself. You work yourself up into a certain emotional state and then suddenly you explode. And you feel everything go out. And you cannot repeat it. There's no desire to repeat it. It was an actual psychic, sexual act. But there's no physical act. There is no evidence of any physical act. But it's the same thrill that you would were it a physical act. Work yourself right up into that state and then let it go. And do not raise one finger to make it so, any more than you would after impregnation. What can you do after pregnancy is taking place? Nothing. Leave it alone and let it take place in its own good time. Now let us go into the silence.
Now, as you're seated here, that's all about you. Your own wonderful human imagination is the God of the universe. That is the one spoken of as the Lord Jesus. That's the one. Is it really true? Well, you're called upon to test it. Test it and see if it's true. Now, I have a letter on me tonight. I really should read it, but I'm not going to. I should read it just as he wrote it, but I'll tell you the contents of the letter. This gentleman hasn't been here in years. The last time I saw him was at the Ebell. Well, you know who have been coming since the Ebell, how long that has been. He said, "I must tell you this story. It may not make sense, but I must tell it. For it's the first time that I have ever used my training according to the things that I have heard you say. I am a psychologist, and I have wasted years trying to talk people out of their mental problems when I could easily have imagined them whole and happy. Now, here is the story." He said, "A friend of mine, this lady, claimed that she was in many ways abnormal. She and her husband adopted a little baby girl, and something very strange went wrong with the child. The child was 4 years old and still could not speak, and the few words it muttered, it garbled so that it is simply not intelligible. But in the 4 years talking to her, there was progress. Then one day she said to me, 'I do not feel any longer that I am abnormal.' So now I say to myself, I am not abnormal. he tried to explain to her that that's not quite the approach. And then he broke the thought and he told me this story. He said, for instance, in my own case, I find a home that I want. I begin to imagine that I'm living in that home, and then doubt sets in, with the result that that doubt materializes into a person. And that person has more money than I have, and he buys the home, leaving me out in the cold. I know from that experience that every person in my world only reflects a mood in me. Everyone that I meet, whether I know them or a stranger who buys the home that I wanted, when the doubt set in, the doubt materialized into a person. I didn't know him, but he only reflects that mood of doubt in me. So he has more money and he buys the home, and I am out in the cold. So I reconstructed a sentence for this lady. And I said, no longer must you say, I am not abnormal. You must now begin to say, I am perfectly normal. She said, I do not feel that. He said, I do not care whether you feel it or not. You must begin to persuade yourself that you are perfectly normal by repeating within yourself, I am perfectly normal. The day she began it, the child went into a coma. So profound was the sleep that it was difficult to rouse her. She could not be awakened. She asked me to examine the child. I said, no, take her to a medical clinic and have them examine the child. But as she began, from his suggestion, to assume I am perfectly normal, within 24 hours the child awoke. They made the test in the medical center and found her alert and bright. She was only the outpictured statement of that mother who adopted her. The mother began to feel, I am abnormal. So she adopts a little child, a little girl. And the girl for 4 years couldn't talk. And when she began, it was so garbled, it made no sense. She only bore witness to that strange, peculiar claim of the mother who adopted her. And when she changed the pattern of speech within her and said, I am perfectly normal, the child, by the medical clinic, found her not only alert, but perfectly healthy and returning to a normal state in this world. The whole vast world is yourself pushed out. All that you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your own wonderful human imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow.
I am telling you this from experience. I know it. If you go to jail and you say 5 to 10 years, all right, you know 5 years, and maybe you get off in 6 for good behavior. But when you are drafted into the army, there is no date that you are promised where they let you out. You're in for the duration. Well, I was drafted into the army with $17 million. Well, I didn't ask the permission of anyone. I only consulted myself. I looked around. I knew what the world knew. It was something that had to be done. But I must be honest with myself. I didn't want any part of it, but no part of it. Others would tell me, is that the act of a coward? I didn't care what they said. Is that being a good citizen? I didn't care what they said. As I just said earlier, what we now know, which is called reason, it's a reasonable thing to do. We're at war, and we're all Americans, and we should go in there because our country has declared war. Go in there and fight. And so reason tells us that should be done. And I was drafted. I did not oppose it. They drafted me. Took me down to Camp Hook, Louisiana for my base training. And while I was there, I didn't want any part of it. And I dared to assume that I am out of it. And made my normal natural application, as you have to do in the world of Caesar. Within 24 hours, it came back, and it was simply rejected. It was signed, disapproved, and signed by my colonel, a very nice gentleman. His name was Colonel Theodore Bilbo Jr. His father was Senator of Mississippi. I said nothing. My captain said, "For your sake, Goddard, I am very, very sorry. I know exactly how you feel. You want to be with your wife and your little girl. Your son is in Guadalcanal with the Marines, and you are now almost 38. And so I know, but I would like to go through this war with a man just like you at my side. So I can't say that I am sorry for myself. I'm sorry only for you." I didn't say one word to him, to the colonel. I didn't oppose it. That was the decision of Caesar. Now, I looked into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and I persevered in that law. And I slept that night as though I slept in my own home in New York City on Washington Square, where I lived on the 7th floor. I lived on that floor, and it was a very large apartment, 2 bedrooms, a lovely big living room, a dining room, a huge kitchen, and the foyer. And I slept in that place just as though I were there, not in the army. I fell asleep in that state, having done all the normal things that would make me feel this arrangement is perfect. I rearranged the structure of my mind. Instead of seeing 25 men around me sleeping upstairs and knowing that 25 are down below in the next area, I slept in my own bed with my wife in her bed and my little girl in her crib in the corner. I felt everything in that place just as though it's taking place. And I rearranged the structure of my mind and fell sound asleep in that state. At 4 o'clock in the morning, here comes a sheet of paper before my eyes and a hand from here down with a pen in its hand. And the pen scratched out the word "disapproved." And it wrote in a bold script, "approved." And then I heard the word, "That which I have done, I have done. Do nothing." And then I woke. It was too early to disturb the 25 other fellows sleeping there. But I waited until the very first moment that I could leave that room. Went down to the latrine and shaved and bathed early and came up filled with a glow that the whole thing was done. All right, I walked in that assumption for the next 9 days. 9 days later, the same colonel that disapproved my request called me in. He said, "Close the door, Goddard." So I closed the door. He said, "Take a seat." Well, he never asked me to take a seat in his presence before. I was a private. You always stood in his presence. He said, "Take a seat." And then he gave me all the reasons in the world why I should still be in the army. He said, "You still want to get out?" I said, "Yes, sir." Gave me another reason. "You still want to get out?" I said, "Yes, sir." Another one. When he exhausted all the reasons why I should be in the army, and I'm still saying, "Yes, sir," he said, "All right, bring me another application, have your captain sign it," which I did. That day, I was honorably discharged and out of the army. I didn't run away. I was honorably discharged. When vision breaks forth into speech, the presence of deity is there. And who can oppose God? says, that which I have done, I have done. Do nothing. So he thought he initiated the urge to let me go free. I looked into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and I persevered in that law. And he played his part, for I rearranged the structure of my mind.
So I know it works. It took me 1 week to do it. That's all that it took me. 1 week. I simply went sound asleep in the assumption that my wife was there. And it's the girl to whom I'm now married and who bore us this glorious daughter. And it's been since 1936. So here, this heavenly state was denied me because I wasn't feeding myself the right food. I have food you know not of, and the food are words. And you repeat them within yourself. What am I saying? As Blake said, oh, what have I said? What have I done? Oh, all-powerful human words. What have I said? What have I done? Oh, all-powerful human words. If man only realized what he is doing when he is talking seemingly idly. So, after all, who cares? Who knows? Who knows? The only one that cares knows. And he is your own wonderful human imagination. That is God. That's the Jehovah of the Old Testament and the Jesus of the New. And there is no other God. And he's buried in you. And he's dreaming in you. And surely you want to awake. But you will awake the day that you actually move in to the life of imagination, where you trust your imagination and live in it. You're not far from the threshold of rebirth. But I can't tell you the day or the hour. No one knows but the Father, and the Father is your own wonderful human imagination. I saw it so clearly. This is the stone that the builders rejected. But what the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. It was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our sight. So I rejected the fact that I was the cause of the phenomena of my life. I couldn't believe it. I thought everyone outside of myself caused it. Then I realized, when I saw the vision, here is a stone, a quartz, and it fragmented into numberless parts. As he said, the one who bought the home, that's a fragmented part of my own being. My doubt brought him into being. He materialized my doubt. A man, a person. And he bought the home I wanted because he had more money. I materialized that. It came out of me. So the whole thing fragmented. And then when it came together and formed itself into a man, seated in the lotus posture, and I looked at it, I'm looking at myself. Then I realized I am the cause. He is the dreamer in me. One day he is going to awake from this dream. And when he awakes, I am he. And he and I are one. This is the story I am trying to tell the whole vast world. Because I know it's true, and the day will come, you will know it's true. There is no other God than your own wonderful human imagination. I still would invite you, although I've told you to do it yourself, I still invite you, if you feel uneasy about it, to ask of me. For in the end, may I tell you, we are one. Now let us go into the silence.
I'm very glad that you came tonight. For I have a story to tell you, and the one who gave it to me is here tonight. But I'll prepare you for it first, for I've been teaching it for years and years and years. We can hear it and never apply it. And though I repeat night after night,
we are the operant power. It doesn't operate itself. We still postpone it. Quite often our training is in conflict with it, and we can't quite bring ourselves to apply it. Now, I have a letter on me tonight. I really should read it, but I'm not going to. I should read it just as you wrote it, but I'll tell you the contents of the letter. This gentleman hasn't been here in years. The last time I saw him was at the Ebell. So you know who's been coming since the Ebell, how long that has been. He said, I must tell you this story. It may not make sense, but I must tell it. For it's the first time that I have ever used my training according to the things that I have heard you say. I am a psychologist, and I have wasted years trying to talk people out of their mental problems when I could easily have imagined them whole and happy. Now, here is the story. He said, a friend of mine, this lady, claimed that she was in many ways abnormal. She and her husband adopted a little baby girl, and something very strange went wrong with the child. The child was 4 years old and still could not speak, and the few words it muttered, it garbled so that it was simply not intelligible. But in the 4 years talking to her, there was progress. Then one day she said to me, I do not feel any longer that I am abnormal. So now I say to myself, I am not abnormal. He tried to explain to her that that's not quite the approach. So I reconstructed a sentence for this lady. And I said, no longer must you say, I am not abnormal. You must now begin to say, I am perfectly normal. She said, I do not feel that. He said, I do not care whether you feel it or not. You must begin to persuade yourself that you are perfectly normal by repeating within yourself, I am perfectly normal. The day she began it, the child went into a coma. So profound was the sleep that it was difficult to rouse her. She could not be awakened. She asked me to examine the child. I said, no, take her to a medical clinic and have them examine the child. But as she began, from his suggestion, to assume I am perfectly normal, within 24 hours the child awoke. They made the test in the medical center and found her alert and bright. She was only the outpictured statement of that mother who adopted her. The mother began to feel, I am abnormal. So she adopts a little child, a little girl. And the girl for 4 years couldn't talk. And when she began, it was so garbled, it made no sense. She only bore witness to that strange, peculiar claim of the mother who adopted her. And when she changed the pattern of speech within her and said, I am perfectly normal, the child, by the medical clinic, found her not only alert, but perfectly healthy and returning to a normal state in this world. The whole vast world is yourself pushed out. All that you behold, though it appears without, it is within. In your own wonderful human imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow.
Every little thing has an interval of time between the act and its fulfillment. A horse will take 12 months. A woman takes 9 months. The little sheep will take 5 months. A chicken will take 21 days. There are intervals of time. So the Bible teaches every vision has its own appointed hour. It ripens. It will flower. If it be late, then wait, for it is sure, and it will not be late. Different intervals of time. So it may take thee a longer time. In this case with this man, 2 months to bring back 4,000 who were unemployed. To put his mind at rest that he doesn't have now to feel that he's going to be fired. He can put in now the extra time. Only a little while, 3 years and 2 months will complete his 30 years with Jones and Laughlin. And then what's a man of his age? 6 more years, and then Social Security. So he'd have both. If it happened now, he wouldn't have it. He would be cut on Social Security, and he would be let out without a good retirement fund. So she goes back, and she reminds him that it happened before. He couldn't afford the roof for the house. And she said, I will see the roof on the house. I remember when it needed a roof. And so she told him, I recall telling you, I remember when it needed it. Well, soon after something happened in his work, he got the money and the roof is on. The wife wanted an organ, couldn't afford the organ. All right, she said, I remember when you didn't have one. She has the organ. And she took one after the other. Of all these things, he's still, with all the evidence in the world, he is still working on some outside God. He thinks he's doing the wrong thing. He feels that if perchance that man is simply a devil incarnate, and he's taken me from my real God, which means something external to himself, that he fashions out of his own mind and fashions with his hand, because all these little nonsenses that we buy and stick them up as holy objects. First of all, no artist really ever designed them. It's an offense to speak of an artist when you see these horrible monstrosities that we buy and stick around the place and call them religious objects. So, find who he is. He is the living God. He is not a dead God. So I tell you that all that you behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your own wonderful human imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. All things exist in the human imagination, and everything you see as an objective reality was produced by imagining. Think of one thing, just think of one thing that would simply deny it. You can't think of one thing. So you go to the moon. You first had to imagine it. Had to imagine everything concerning the machine that took you to the moon. Everything in the world first has to be imagined and then executed. All right. The intelligence to do it will come, but you take the blueprint first and conceive it and dwell in it as though it were true. And no power on earth can stop it from becoming so. Your visions will clarify itself. At night, it's a different kind of a night. Your days are different. You see people differently. You can't walk by any man and not see him God incarnate. Can't do it. Even if he has the most horrible background. And he said simply, well, a murderer. And it's proven that he is. You still see God incarnate. But so sound asleep, the poor thing doesn't know. If you could only just get to it and show him that he really is God incarnate. And the one he thought he killed, he has been restored to life. Not to the senses of man, but he is restored in a world just like this, terrestrial just like this. About his business, he continues his work until he too awakens from this dream of life. We all will awaken eventually. But why not start now? Start now to tell man who he really is. God and man are one. Man is all imagination, and God is man, and exists in us and we in him. The eternal body of man is the imagination, and that is God himself. Nothing but God in the universe. All God. And eventually, you and I will awake. And because God is one, not two, you and I are one. Without loss of identity. That's one of the strangest mysteries in the world. Without loss of identity, we are one. I know that from my own personal experience. We are one. And yet, I am individualized. And you are individualized. And we tend forever and forever toward ever greater and greater individualization. And yet, we are one. And I will bring that out to the best of my ability as we proceed with these series of lectures. You will hear it. But tonight, if you're here for the first time and you want something practical, you apply what I've told you.